Hi everybody, I'm the Academic Leftist, and in this video I wanted to talk about stop and frisk, specifically whether or not the practice of stop and frisk in New York actually succeeded in stopping crime. So before I begin, just a reminder that if you liked this video and you've liked my content, please like, subscribe, and comment below. Okay, so stop and frisk was the practice of stopping individuals on the streets if the police deemed them to be suspicious, searching them for any weapons and contraband, and then making an arrest if the evidence warranted. Now, in 2013, a federal judge ruled that the New York City Police Department had violated the constitutional rights of minorities, Hispanics and African Americans, by stopping them without probable cause throughout the course of several years in order to see if they had any weapons, and then searching them for drugs, contraband, and making an arrest or releasing them if the evidence didn't warrant it. Now, what they also found was that through the practice of stop and frisk, minorities were stopped over 2/3 of the time, despite the fact that they made up just a little over 50% of the population of New York. Now, conservative proponents or supporters of this practice have argued that it played an important role in actually reducing New York City's crime rate, violent crime rate, and property crimes from the period when it was implemented around 2008 up until the period when it was actually terminated in 2013. Now, critics, of course, point out correctly that crime was dropping in New York City prior to the implementation of stop and frisk, and that it actually continued to fall even after the practice was significantly pared down and then largely terminated after the 2013 ruling by a federal judge. So the question here is whether or not it really did succeed in stopping crime. Now, before we tackle that question, it's important to note that this actually does have precedence. It actually goes all the way back to 1968 in a case called Terry versus Ohio, where an individual brought a lawsuit against the police department in Ohio for violating his constitutional rights. He, along with one other person, had been repeatedly looking into shop windows. He was stopped by the police. They searched him, and upon searching them, they found out that they did actually have weapons, and they made an arrest. Both the men were African American. Now, the court ruled in 1968 that the constitutional rights of these plaintiffs were not violated because there was probable cause for them to actually be stopped. And they further went on to rule that the police do have the right to actually stop individuals if there is reasonable suspicion that they might commit a crime. And they do also have the right then to frisk and pat them down to ensure that they don't actually have weapons, just to protect their own safety. So ever since 1968, a number of other decisions have further codified this practice. The issue here is whether or not during the practice of stop and frisk, the police officers actually had reasonable cause or probable suspicion to stop the majority of the individuals on the streets of New York. And what the federal judge found in 2013 is that in many instances, they did not. The police simply stopped individuals based on suspicion that was not linked to any kind of a probable cause that they might have been about to commit a crime or that they might actually be carrying weapons. And in doing so, they ended up violating their constitutional rights. Now, what's interesting here is that, as I've mentioned in my other videos, it's not very helpful to point to aggregate trends in crime rates and a particular practice in determining whether or not the said practice actually had an impact on that crime rate. So while conservative proponents of stop and frisk are correct to say that crime rates were decreasing as stop and frisk actually increased in New York City, it's also important to point out that only about 13% of any of these stop and frisk practices actually produced sufficient evidence to warrant an arrest or a court proceeding. The vast majority of these stop and frisk procedures do not result in any kind of an arrest or any kind of charges being brought against the individuals. And the majority of those who were stopped, again, were African Americans and Hispanics. Now, proponents of stop and frisk also point out, of course, that African Americans and Hispanics were the ones who were stopped the most during this practice because they simply were the ones who were committing most of the crimes statistically. And in fact, the police, through CompuStat, sent a large number of police officers to hotspot areas where the majority of violent crime and property crimes were actually being committed. And what's interesting is we do have this study that specifically looked at this level of microspace and micro locations. And what the study actually found was that there was a modest but significant reduction in crime in these hotspot areas, in these micro areas, as a result of the practice of stop and frisk. So it does appear that stop and frisk did have some impact on crime. by preempting the perpetration of property crimes or violent crimes by seizing weapons ahead of time. So the question here is, really, is this modest reduction in crime through stop and frisk really worth the cost that it incurred? And if you've seen my other videos, clearly the answer to this question would be no. The reason being is because, as these study authors also point out, it actually eroded the legitimacy of the New York City Police Department. It eroded trust between communities and the police, specifically communities in these hotspot areas where a large amount of crime was taking place because of the collateral damage it entailed. And clearly, there should not be a practice where a large number of innocent people are stopped and frisked simply because they belong to a demographic that statistically commits more violent crimes and property crimes than other demographics, because of course there are socioeconomic conditions and reasons as to why this might occur. And so simply having a correlation between these demographics and certain crime rates isn't sufficient to actually treat every member of that demographic as a potential criminal through these type of stop and frisk practices. And of course there is a psychological toll that these type of practices have on those who are actually being stopped simply by virtue of belonging to a particular demographic, race, or ethnicity. So really, while we could answer in the affirmative to the question, did stop and frisk reduce crime to a certain extent, it's really the wrong question in my view. It needs to be reframed to look at whether or not the practice was worth it in terms of a cost-benefit analysis. And here the answer is clearly no. And so again, the best way to actually reduce crime is to tackle structural root causes and to, in the short term, find more efficient police practices that actually could have the same impact without actually treating entire demographics as criminals. Okay, anyways, I hope you liked this very short video. Again, if you've enjoyed this content, please remember to like, subscribe, and comment below, and I'll see you in my next vid. Thank you.